Rebecca Pearce will be talking about rethinking our food industry. I know Rebecca's a relatively new member, and I realize I've been negligent. I didn't get her bio. I thought I had it, but I don't. So Rebecca, before you start on your presentation, maybe you could tell us a little about yourself and then launch into your presentation. Thank you, Rebecca.
Sure. I introduced myself when I joined in April. I did the climate reality training, I think in April. But I always said that that was sort of my gateway to you guys because I wanted to take action here in the Dallas community. Um, I think, kind of like what Julie was saying, is like, I'm one person. I can do all that I can at my home, but I just wanted to see how I could be part of a bigger movement. And I'm glad I found this home. I introduced myself as a plant person uh, from the beginning. I just kept kind of find my niche and my passion for all things plants, whether it be gardening or eating sustainably, um, moving in the sustainable food world. I could talk about it all day. I'll talk about it for 45 minutes. I guess I should say I'm not an expert on anything particular in this subject matter, but a generalist in a lot of it. So yeah, my passion will hopefully come out. And I'm conscious of time. So if you see me checking, I'm just going to set my phone on a timer here so that way I don't take up too much. This is my first time on a Zoom presentation, so do I just press share screen? Share.
Yep, it works. We can see it.
Okay, great. Can everybody see that? Yeah,
Yep.
okay, great. Okay, so I'm just gonna start that. So rethinking our food industry, I'm so excited to talk about this because I'm really passionate about it. What was that? Oh, maybe somebody, sorry, maybe that was just somebody unmuted. Maureen from this group sent out an amazing TED Talk a few months ago that talks about inspiration and optimism being propellers of change. And I really like that. So I'm going to try and sprinkle positivity in and amongst the doom and gloom. I'm going to be talking about a lot of categories and subcategories in our food system today. I'm really scratching the surface on some of these topics, and I know there will be a lot of it that it will be unsaid. I'm just trying to talk for less than 45 minutes. So but my main point is that I want to bring awareness and thought provocation of an industry that really doesn't get as much hype, if you will, as the plastics and the electric vehicles and the oil companies do. In fact, as Roger pointed out, that COP26 went by without a single day for the food and agricultural industry on the agenda at all. So I'll give us some actionable steps so we can keep propelling us forward. But what I want to make clear is that we can't call for action if we're unaware of the problems. So that's what I want to start off with and talk about this. I just found this quote kind of inspiring on this random meme page. It's a hypothetical quote, of course. When people talk about time traveling to the past, a worry is doing something small that could radically change the present. But rarely does anyone in the present think that they can radically change the future by doing something small. This graph is from Project Drawdown. Roger told me many of you existing members would be familiar with this organization and their work. And for anyone who may not be familiar with this organization, this graph does a great job of illustrating the big contributors to our emissions crisis. And only 1% away from electricity production is the food and agricultural industry in the green line there. And yet we don't have very many groups in Texas specifically focusing on this issue. It seems when we talk diet and lifestyle, people tend to shy away from the topic, so not to avoid hurt feelings, or at least that's what I've experienced in the past. But this shows clearly why, if we are truly advocates for climate change, we need to be vocal about our food system and everything it encompasses, just as much as we are about plastics, electric vehicles, and oil companies. Before explaining how we can take individual and group action, I'll first go through the ways we've got our food system wrong over the years. This will look familiar to most of us. We grew up with a similar version of this. This is the current food pyramid in the US. We have, of course, our grains, vegetables, fruits, milk, meat and beans, and in the yellow sliver is oils, fats and oils. I just wanted to start off here so we can have a common understanding of what a traditional American diet is. By no means does this mean this is how most Americans are eating. But before we get into the breakdown of what our current diet is, let's talk about where we come from. So I want to take it back hundreds, even thousands of years back. When speaking about the best way to eat and how we should look at the food system moving forward, we like to talk about what our ancestors ate. There's a specific diet today that many of you may have heard of called the keto or Stone Age diet, among others, that reference what we used to eat. And this idea is centered around eating more whole foods and less processed foods, which is probably the best general health advice that humans can do. But there's a major hiccup in this thinking. It assumes that all of our ancestors ate the same things, when in reality, we had a lot of cavemen out there, and we all ate different from one another based on our geographical area, which is of course determined by weather and topography. You can find any bias confirming the information you want on the internet. You can find articles that our ancestors mostly ate plant-based diets. You can find articles that there were a lot of milk and meat and cheese in our diets. But I found this particular National Geographic article to be the most helpful to explain the diversity of information here. And the answer is what we used to eat depended on where your ancestors were and who they were, geographically speaking, where they lived. For example, the indigenous people of Siberia ate very differently than the Amazonian tribe pictured here in modern day Bolivia. And it's obviously because of their environment, which makes total sense. And it's really obvious when you look at it from this point of view. So I'm not going to come today with a blanket statement of what our diets looked like 100 years ago or what it looked like 1,000 years ago, because it depended. What continent were you on? Were you a settler in that new land? And when we say their diet consisted of meat, what kind of meat exactly? For example, this photo is from the Taimane people, and pictured here is a coatee's paw, which is like raccoon. This is what their meat is. So we often hear the saying, you are what you eat, but there's an argument that you are what your ancestors ate. I just want to give two examples into the science of this, and stick with me here because we'll circle back to it when we get to the health component of it. Populations that traditionally ate more starchy foods, such as the Hazda people pictured here, have more copies of the gene than those Siberian, the indigenous Siberian called the Yakut eaters did. They were predominantly meat eaters, and 99% of their calories came from narwhal and whale. So very differently, the Hazda saliva genetically helps break down starches before the food even reaches their stomach. And this wasn't needed for the Yakut people and their descendants. Here are a few of today's food pyramids of countries around the world. I'll point out the large olive oil in the Mediterranean diet compared to ours in the US, and the specific red meat category at the top. But I love that the Chinese graph is a pagoda rather than a pyramid. All of these cultural differences in the modern diet make sense when we know about our ancestors. The lactose intolerance is the second example that I wanted to bring up. All humans digest mother's milk when they're infants, but once weaned, they no longer needed specific enzymes to break down lactase. After human beings began herding cattle, it became tremendously advantageous to digest milk, and lactose tolerance evolved among the cattle herders in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. But groups not dependent on cattle, such as the Chinese, Thai, and Pima Indians of the American Southwest, remained lactose intolerant. There's a lot more in this topic that you can research if food genetics interests you. I just mentioned this to get you thinking from a different perspective and how it plays a part in our individual health. So if we've adjusted our food pyramids and pagodas for cultural differences, then what's the problem with today's food industry? And why am I pointing out the past when our focus needs to be on the future? This research into our past is so critically important because we are projecting an increase of 2 billion people by 2050. And we all know we already have a major food distribution issue. So how are we going to feed these 2 billion people? Some researchers think the answers lie in our last remaining hunter-gatherer tribes, who for thousands of years have used our land sustainably to feed themselves. I want to define a few of these nuances with diets here for those who are unclear. A plant-based is a diet consisting largely or solely of vegetables, grains, pulses, or other foods derived from plants rather than animal products, but they may still eat eggs or milk. It's a subjective definition with no exact allowance of amount of animal products. Whereas a vegetarian is the complete exclusion of meat and seafood from a diet, and they can choose to eliminate other products. Veganism is a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as possible and practical, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. There are other isms such as reductarianism, flexitarianism, there's pescatarian, and these all have their different nuances of diet, such as just simply reducing your intake of meat or not eating meat, but eating seafood. This chapter, the DFW chapter, has taught me that your carbon footprint was just a marketing campaign made up by the fossil fuel industry. But if tracking this statistic is your thing, then research from the University of Oxford says going vegan is the single quickest way to reduce your carbon footprint by up to 73%. So I'll go ahead and start with land. This is how I've decided to break down the food industry. Obviously, there is so much to talk about here, but this is just the way that I'm going to attempt to try in this breakdown of a graph. There is a finite amount of land. As we increase our population, the demand for agricultural space increases. The higher up in the food chain we eat, the more farmable land required. For example, if you're eating a lamb chop, you can trace back the land requirements to the pasture or the factory farm for the lamb, the land for the processing center or the slaughterhouse, and the land to grow the crops to feed the lamb throughout its lifetime. And then the land, of course, for the carers of the lamb, the care for the crops and the workers of the slaughterhouse. If you were to eat a vegan meal, you're now just looking at the land required to grow the crop and the land for the farmer who tends to the crop. Another obvious point, the bigger the animal, the more land and food it needs. So how much food does animal agriculture consume? We know most of Earth is comprised of only, we know that Earth is comprised mostly of water with only 29% of land. It's the top bar, obviously, just because we're talking about it, it's bigger, but I'll point out that much of human history, the world was wilderness, forests, grasslands, and shrubbery. But over the last few centuries, this has changed dramatically with wild habitats being squeezed out for agricultural purposes. In the visualization, we see the breakdown of land surface. The second line down where the big bar graph is yellow, 10% of the world is glaciers, 19% is barren land, deserts, beaches, sand dunes, and this leaves what we call habitable land. So then the following line, half of all habitable land is used for agriculture. Now, if you look at the line below that, land use between livestock and crops for human consumption. If we combine pastures used for grazing with land used to grow crops for animal feed, livestock accounts for 77% of global farming land. While livestock takes up most of the world's agricultural land, it only produces 18% of the world's calories and 37% of total protein. Here's an interesting graph that shows the makeup of the land usage for the United States. By and large, cow pastures are the largest, following by a considerable amount for the livestock feed to the right there. And then just above is the food we eat. So very quickly, we can establish it takes more land for animal agriculture than it does eating lower on the food chain. This is an interesting map done in 2017 based off of research in 2011. Researchers took the average diet from each country, calculated the land use required to sustain the diet, and then calculated if the global population adopted it. But to be clear, this is just land, not seafood. Countries shown in blue's average diet, if adopted globally, would result in less land use for agriculture than current levels. Yellow countries would be an increase in land use, but physically viable, and orange countries have a dietary requirement that is not physically feasible on a global scale. Absolutely no shock the US is in the orange, right? So just to rephrase, if the world adopted our average diet, what we are eating, we would literally not have enough land to feed everyone. Would anybody like to take a guess what country had the most physically unfeasible diet? It's actually not the US.
Argentina.
Oh, close. They were number 2. It's actually New Zealand. Good job. Yeah, the top 5 were New Zealand, Argentina, Australia, Bermuda, Mongolia, with the United States being number 6. This graph illustrates the countries plotted out based just specifically on their beef consumption, which you can see the same top 10 from the previous map. They're correlated here. They're the highest beef consumers. Arguably, one of the highest impact changes we can make to our diets is to reduce our meat intake, particularly that of beef or lamb. Mutton is what we call sheep when we eat them when they're not a baby. In this chart, we see the relative land requirements per gram of protein across a range of food. Though overall meat consumption is projected to increase, in good news, here's my positivity, there is some indication that beef consumption has peaked in high income countries. So positive. The most publicized example of this was land use for food agriculture came with the burning of the Brazilian rainforest. In 2020, the whole world watched and was pouring in outcries for the Brazilian government to do something about the fires. These fires were intentional for land clearing, specifically for livestock agriculture, and some were unintentional because of the uncontrolled spread. If you followed this story, you understand it has a lot to do with government deregulation and the unenforcement of policies to protect the indigenous peoples of their land. Let's get soybeans out of the way because I hear about it a lot when we talk land use. Firstly, soy is not bad for you. At best, it's ignorance because there are so many studies debunking the myth that it is. And at worst, it's racist because there's a large portion of the globe where soy is a staple of the country's cuisine, and they don't grow extra limbs or have hormonal imbalances. Soy is predominantly grown for livestock consumption, not human consumption. 77% of livestock, 77% of global feed is fed to livestock. Only 7% is used directly for food products such as tofu, soy milk, and tempeh. So the next time someone says soy is bad for the environment, you should agree, but make sure the understanding that it is being used to feed livestock, not people eating edamame beans. Okay, we can't talk about land without talking about the soil underneath. There is so much to be learned about our soil and so much that I wish I could dive into today, but here's a few key points. Humans don't manufacture essential minerals in the body. Minerals come from rock, salt, and water, and they're absorbed as the plants grow or by animals as the animals eat the plants. Fresh foods aren't our only source of dietary minerals. Nowadays, some processed foods like breakfast cereal have begun being fortified with minerals. One of the widest examples of this is when they began incorporating iodine in our table salts in the 1920s, and it's still done today. It's because the average person wasn't getting the proper amount from food alone. There are many, many, many studies and decades of research showing our food is not as nutritious as it was hundreds or even 30 years ago. I won't go into the percentage of declines, but instead the 2 main reasons for that. Firstly, we have begun favoring high yield crops that have improved traits in size, growth rates, and pest resistance over nutrient dense crops. This makes sense because we were trying to feed billions more people than we had 2 centuries ago. And secondly, how we farm our soil can leave us with 2 different outputs. We can either thicken the soil or thin it. There's been a lot of hysteria in the previous years about how many years of farmable soil we have left. I've seen headlines about 60 years of farmable land left, but this can be similar to our conversation about what our ancestors ate. There's a lot of soil on this earth and we can't group all the soil the same. There's no expiration date for the earth's soil. Approximately, they're guessing 23% of Earth's soil has less than 100-year lifespan if we continue with the current farming practices, but the majority has over 1,000 years of life left. The degradation of the soil has to do with monocrop culture, causing erosion, overworking the soil, and not cover cropping, which are all things we can change. We can make immediate change. There's a new trend in large companies allowing or proclaiming to pay to offset their carbon using carbon sinks, which pay for farmers to use cover crops. So that's good, and not till their land. It's currently not as regulated and needs to be pushed a bit further, sort of being used as like a get out of jail free card for companies, but it is progress. So here's the positive, the regenerative farms. I say that word weird, regenerative. it's hard for me. It's kind of a buzzword at the moment. It almost like it's new or some new technology, but in reality, it's just returning to some of the most basic practices we did as humans hundreds of years ago. A few of the core principles are diversifying crops, so moving away from our monocrop agriculture system, crop covering, meaning not leaving the earth bare and allowing for that erosion, no tillage, meaning not digging through and messing up with the biomes and the humes that are underneath the ground, integrating livestock within the space, and reducing pesticides and fertilizers. There is so much positive here when it comes to regenerative farming. It addresses so many of the climate issues here. Currently, there's only a small percentage of farms that are practicing this way, but it continues to increase as information is out there. And as a gardener, I wish I could stay here in my presentation because I could speak ad nauseum about how we should buy from regenerative farms. You should grow a garden. You should plant a seed. But there's a lot of new information about soil. There's a documentary on Netflix, Kiss the Ground, I think is a pretty decent starting point. So this is where you say, but bacon. But the expansion of agriculture industry is one of humanity's largest impacts on our environment. It has transformed habitats, and it's one of the greatest pressures for diversity. Of the 28,000 species that are threatened with extinction, agriculture is listed as a threat for 24,000 of them. But we know we can reduce these impacts. And this is where we need to put our policy where our mouth is. If we really want to help people cut down the amount of meat we're eating, we need to issue clear dietary guidelines of eat less meat and eat more plants. We need to stop subsidizing cattle feed and stop giving tax breaks to cattle ranchers. We need to transition away from the subsidies and the infallibilities. Okay, let's move on to water. If you remember from the graphic earlier, only 29% of Earth is land, meaning the remaining 71% is water. And again, I'm just going to state the obvious: the more land we need and the higher up in the food chain we eat, the more water we consume to water the plants, to feed the lamb, to then eat the lamb, versus just watering the crops to eat the crops. That makes sense, but I don't actually want to get into the subsection of water here. For this presentation, I want to talk about our oceans. This is that same map from earlier. Countries like China were labeled blue, meaning they would require less land if we adopted their diet globally. But I made the important distinction that this was land only, not in regards to seafood. As you may know, China and other several countries, Japan, that are along the coast have a large portion of their diet made up of seafood. I just want to tell a personal story here. I grew up in South Louisiana where eating seafood was the way of life because seafood was so plentiful, fresh, and abundant. I first went scuba diving in 2011 and I was immediately hooked. When I lived in Thailand in 2014, I became a certified scuba diver. And when our days of certification were over and we graduated, our instructor suggested we go eat at this great seafood restaurant. And we went and we all sat down and we ordered this big, huge plate of seafood. And for the first time, I had this thought, wait, if I enjoy swimming to the bottom and looking at all these cool fish and colorful sea life, I then can't come up and eat them. From that, I made a personal and moral decision, but what the conclusion that I came to was based off of facts. We're just taking too much fish out of the ocean. And in Dallas, like, where is this fish coming from? Just as Old MacDonald is the picturesque farmer behind your fried chicken, so is the ideal image of a hardworking fisherman sitting out patiently for their line to get a nibble. But this is the reality of what commercial fishing is, and it's depleting our oceans. It's tough to comprehend the massive amounts of sea animals who are killed yearly, especially when so much of it is indirect and considered byproduct. When we target specific species of fish and do the large nets, we are disrupting ecological systems. For example, if we are fishing too much of prey species, such as sardines and anchovies, we're reducing the supply chain for the predators, making them smaller in size or starving. Or if we overfish the predators, we are leaving a loss of diversity and creating dead zones within the ocean. Here's a graph that shows fish consumption by country, with China by and large being the largest capturers of fish and the largest fish farmers as well. A dead zone is an area of an ocean or lake that has too little oxygen to support marine life. It can happen naturally, though it is, of course, exacerbated exponentially by human activity. The Gulf of Mexico is the second largest dead zone in the world. And as you can see from this photo, it is in large part due to the Mississippi River. With our current farming practices of fertilizers, with animal waste, and with sewage, each year it makes its way down the river channels and dumps into the area you see highlighted. There's a chain of events that then happen, including algae blooms, food chain disruption for those fish, which is a loss of oxygen, and eventually a dead zone that continues to grow. So not only are we taking too much fish and we're creating dead zones, but we're also putting back in too much trash. Polluted oceans are a well-known fact. We've all seen that picture with the turtle with the straw. Fishing gear accounts for roughly 10% of the ocean debris. Discarded nets, lines, and ropes now make up between 46 to 86% of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. I'll point out one specific way that we're commercially fishing that is doing the most harm. It's called bottom trawling. And as seen from the depiction here, it is literally scraping the bottom for marine life. Seafood consumption is expected to increase by 35% or more in the next 20 years. With the global catch of wild fish stagnant, experts say virtually all of that new seafood will have to be farmed. And then with large commercial fishing depleting areas along coasts, we're affecting those local fishermen, the ones that we like to think of, who are trying to do it sustainably. And they have to continue to go further and further out from shore, which of course is more dangerous. So you're probably thinking, oh, well, Rebecca, the solution is simple. We've overfished the wild population, so we should only buy farmed fish. Well, that's what big aquaculture wants you to think, but I'm here to say not so fast. There's two main ways fish are aquafarmed: in open water or on land, specifically in these giant tanks here. Aquaculture has plenty of potential as a sustainable form of agriculture. It's just that the numbers currently of environmentally minded fish farmers are just a small drop in the ocean, really. We know this, right? When there comes big profit, it's also often a climate disaster. Firstly, I'll point out that if we are farming fish that are big enough for humans to find substantial enough for a meal, they are most likely predator fish, such as salmon. Guess then where we have to go to catch the fish to feed the salmon. It takes on average 5 pounds of wild fish to farm 1 pound of salmon. So hot is the aquaculture market that many countries are sending ships to Antarctica to harvest more than 200,000 pounds of tiny krill, which is a major food source for penguins and whales and narwhals and seals. So then comes the thought process, okay, well, how do we reduce their need for wild fish and replace their diets with something like soy? So we're back to now finding more land to grow food for the fish. I mean, like, my head is actually spinning with this thought process. And I'll just point out that antibiotics are a big one in fish factories, and they're currently not regulated yet. They're getting into our water supply through fish sewage. So that is an issue. There's so much being left unsaid here because the ocean is so big and so nuanced, but it's so important in our fight against the climate change. And there is a lot of room. I'm trying to positive spin it here. There's a lot of room for improvement. We can educate for big policy changes here. Okay, I like the trilogy of land, water, air, but what I'm going to talk about next actually encompasses all of them, which is fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. Here's Old McDonald's farm next to a landfill. Again, so much of this is tied together. So when we are doing to our soils is impacting our oceans, is impacting our air. When we're spraying the fertilizers and pesticides and there's runoff from rain or watering, which gets into our water systems, we eventually heads into our groundwater and our oceans. It's causing the dead zones, but also coral bleaching and undrinkable water. Here's an easy to understand problem that highlights the complexity of this. When we have these large scale farms like factory farms or fish farms or monocrop tomato farms, there is a responsible for huge amounts of output for the general population. I'm not talking about community gardens. I'm talking about the one that supplies the wholesalers. And we know for efficiency's sake, diversification is not the answer. So we have these farmers who are focusing on the highest of outputs, which is good for land consumption, but bad when it means pesticides, antibiotics, and fertilizers. Why would a farmer take the risk of swine flu or tomato blight to lose their entire crop and millions of pounds of food? The bigger the production, the more risk of devastation. As we consolidate our food system to less diversity and less handlers, we are essentially agreeing to the use of these chemicals that are guaranteeing the food is there on our shelves. A farmer can't walk by and pick off every tomato hornworm in a 100-acre field, which is such a catch-22. When we spray with pesticides, it does not discriminate against the good and the bad bugs. It keeps them all away, or worse, kills them all. And you don't even have to be a gardener to understand the importance of some insect species when it comes to how our food is literally made. 35% of food crops depend on pollinators, which is an entirely different presentation altogether. But I'll summarize this for you. Honeybees are actually not the best pollinators because they are incredibly effective at keeping pollen on their bodies and legs to bring back to the hives to make honey. In fact, native bees and other pollinators like butterflies, wasps, even mosquitoes and ants who are more effective because they're not holding on to the pollen, but they're dropping it as they go flower to flower. So when we're killing the insects and producing less of a crop, the following year, we have to use more fertilizers to get a higher output, which is straining the soil even more, degrading it, eroding it, and giving it a lower lifespan. Whew. I had to get through that part. It's important because so much of the production of our food is where the majority of the emissions come from. Approximately 80% of the emissions come from the food production component. So what people generally eat matters more than how we get it. In fact, according to Johns Hopkins, if US citizens followed plant-based diets just 1 day per week, they could reduce more emissions than by following an entirely local diet. But it is important to talk about what comes after we make the food. And to understand the environmental impact of transport of food, we first need to understand a bit more about how our food grows. Many people don't know the life cycle of food. It's normal because we're not taught it in school anymore. We're taught basic biology about parts of plants, but we don't know the seasons of food. For most of us, the grocery store is where we get our introduction to food and where we buy the majority of it. It's always big, it's always colorful, it always tastes the same, and miraculously, it's always in stock. But that's not actually how Mother Nature works. Just as there are seasons for weather, there are seasons for food. You might see a little bit of this because sometimes you see turnip on the shelves and other times you'll see an influx of tomatoes. And this is where you find out I used to be a middle school teacher and I love participation in games. So we're going to play Name That Crop, where I show you a picture of a fruit, vegetable, or legume growing and you guess what it is. So feel free to unmute yourselves and just shout it out. I'll start with an easy one here. This is actually two, but they grow quite similar.
No, that's
Broccoli and cauliflower.
Yeah, that's right. And for those who don't know, broccoli is actually just unopened flowers. So this is what broccoli looks like when it's in full bloom, which I think is cool. All right. Does anybody know this one?
Cabbage.
Cabbage.
Oh, Brussels
Brussels
sprouts.
Brussels sprouts. That's right.
No,
Yeah. So it
Brussels
looks like a cabbage on top. Yeah.
I know, I like it.
That's what I was.
Asparagus.
Yes. I mean, it's obvious when you see it, but like I still am so shocked that asparagus just grows out of the ground like grass. I think that's just really wild.
It's like, I know.
Does anybody know this one?
Dragon fruit?
Yeah, that's right. So on the left, it's the flowers, and once they're pollinated, they turn into dragon fruit.
Oh, I love dragon fruit. That's such a weird thing.
Okay, what about this one? This one's another
Artichoke.
artichoke. That's
Artichoke.
right. Another unopened flower. So we just pick it before it's opened, which when it's opened, it's so beautiful. Okay, last one. This is a tricky one. Peanut.
Peanuts.
Yeah,
Yes.
peanut.
Yeah, so they're actually a legume, which is why it's kind of confusing. Some people are allergic to tree nuts, some people are allergic to peanuts. It's because peanuts are a legume that grow under the ground. They're not like your regular nuts. And just to round off our game, I'll finish with a very satisfying harvest of sunflower seeds. Okay, so now that we're all expert crop identifiers, I'll show you this infographic that is specific to what is season in here in Texas. Texas produce in the summer and winter are very different. Have you ever noticed the taste of food is different depending on the season? did you know that strawberries grow in North Texas, but are only in peak season about 4 to 6 weeks out of the year? Which means if you're eating a strawberry any other time than May, plus or minus 2 weeks, they're probably not from North Texas. But everywhere in the world is different seasons and different foods. And I probably don't need to tell you this, but some foods just never grow in Dallas, like tropical fruit, like those pretty dragon fruit and bananas and kiwis. So then the question is, why is the grocery store always stocked with the same fruits and vegetables year round? Because supermarkets are in the business of supply and demand. And I've seen the villainization of celebrities who fly in food from around the world, fresh sushi from Japan, but I don't know that I'm that much different if I'm paying for a pineapple that's grown in Ecuador and I'm buying it every day. Where we live in a world where demand rules, supply is just something to be figured out. From a climate change perspective, the example of the pineapple from Ecuador is an obvious example. But what I want to point out is that sometimes supermarkets work with local farmers to provide items on their shelves, but a lot of times they have a mono agriculture site that produces the majority of that crop, and they then distribute it across the country. From a business standpoint, it makes perfect sense why they would do this: reduce costs, centralize packaging. But from a carbon footprint perspective, I'm picking up a bag of spinach that was grown halfway across the country, then shipped, when I could just be eating a bag of spinach from a local farm. But Trader Joe's can't have a spinach farm in every city. I'm not saying that the solution is to cut pineapples out. I'm not saying that we can't have chocolate covered strawberries in February, but what we need to be more aware of is what is in season, what grows in our area. And next time you go to the grocery store, maybe take a look around. Can you spot what produce is in season? Does your grocery store identify what food is local? I know that Central Market does, and they also point where it's originated to. Yeah, just how can you shop more seasonally? I love this graphic. I think this picture brings up so many topics here. So at the top, of course, we have the farm to table concept. Next is a local farm CSA. For those who are unaware, CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. And that's where a farmer produces directly for a consumer, and you can pick up from a designated point, or they can deliver to your house. Then we have farmers market, supermarket, and food delivery service. I was surprised by the food delivery service. I had maybe never thought about it from that perspective, but I just thought that was an interesting piece. Okay, of course, when we transport the food, how do we usually transport it? If you are guessing a sustainable, eco-friendly package, you'd be wrong. The answer is obviously plastic. And the larger your food chain, the more packaging it entails. We know this. We know that we have the plastic section and the naked section. But just a thought here, I think it's pretty wild that we as consumers buy, we have to pay for the packaging when we buy the product, and then we pay for the packaging when we dispose through the city trash pickup services. And then we pay for the packaging when it inevitably gets littered and our taxes have to pay for disposal and cleanup. Meanwhile, the companies make a profit. There is some really cool ingenuity happening here. We have banana leaves are replacing plastic in Thailand. France is banning plastic packaging for most fruit and vegetables in January 2022. The bottom left is packaging made of palm leaves, and the bottom right was a 6-pack made of the remnants of the wheat and barley from the beer process, which is compostable, biodegradable, and I guess edible for fish. So there's some cool things happening here. Hopefully, at the very minimum, none of us we're all using reusable bags. Bananas and oranges have their own protective layering. We don't need to put it in plastic bags. So instead, what I would like to inspire us to do is similar to how we write our legislators. Why don't we start writing to our grocery stores and writing to these companies who are using so much packaging? It's really easy to just go to the contact us page. This is Trader Joe's, and they even specifically have a component for sustainability and packaging. So super easy way. There's even companies now who are doing that loop system where it's like a milkman delivery service. They drop it off to you. Once you're done, they wash it and you can reuse it. So a lot of exciting things happening in that department. Okay, food waste. It's easy to understand why the longer your food chain, the more waste it can create through spoilage and transport. And obviously buying locally and seasonally, your food is traveling less of a distance and it's staying fresher for longer. Something that's picked in a different hemisphere that then needs to be shipped to America, packaged and placed at a grocery store will just automatically have a shorter shelf life. I'll also make the point that food begins to lose nutrients as it's moving throughout the country, and also while it withers away in your fridge. And I had to laugh when I read this article because I felt really called out. Just because you throw some spinach in an ice bucket and it fluffs up doesn't mean that it magically regains its nutrients. The EPA reported that food waste makes up the largest component of American landfills at about 24%. That was in 2018. As food waste rots in landfills, it emits methane gas, which is worse for global warming than carbon dioxide. Food waste is responsible for 6% of all global emissions. And while I know so much onus is placed on regulators and policymakers, the food waste is something that we can directly impact quickly in our homes. There's so many great tips about how to reduce your food waste, bringing a shopping list and dehydrating herbs and freezing for later. But one of the biggest ways you can directly impact it is compost. The compost is the process of mixing food waste or greens with browns, such as cardboard and dead leaves. After breaking down, the output is a nutrient powerhouse for the garden. And there was a recent survey for Dallas Sanitation asking if residents wanted curbside pickup for food waste, which we need. And while we wait and continue to push for it, I just want to give you guys some ideas about how you can start at home. So there's pre-existing structures that you can buy, for example, here, or you can DIY it. There's so many great YouTube videos for cheap, affordable solutions that you can do in your backyard. I'm here to break the myth that it's not stinky and yucky. I have the compost tumbler in the middle. It's very mess-free. I've been doing it for about a year, and I have dogs and kids, and it's totally fine. But even if you don't have a yard, you can make it as big or as small as you want, even to, they have systems for apartment dwellers. So definitely an option for everybody. But even if it's still stinky and yucky to you and you don't want to do it, we have a company here in Dallas called Turn Compost, where you can outsource it. They come and pick it up from you and they bring it to somebody who does compost. Super cool. You guys, our health and the health of our planet are deeply intertwined. I'll say it again. Our health and the health of our planet are deeply intertwined. These are all articles from 2021. When we pollute the water, we drink polluted water. When we produce toxins in the air, we are breathing toxic air. Going back to what our ancestors ate and the keto type diets, it's good that it's emphasizing away from processed foods, but the emphasis on the meat is where one of the health issues comes into, especially when we as a society are nowhere near the active lifestyle that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were. And we don't all possess the genetic traits of the Siberian Yakut meat eaters. From a health perspective, I just wanted to mention this dirty dozen list in case you hadn't heard about that before. The whole idea is that when you spray foods with pesticides and fertilizers, these are absorbed through the skin. So when you're eating the foods where you eat the skin, you want to try and buy organically if possible. There's a separate list that states things like watermelon, avocados, where you throw away the peel is not as important to buy organic because you're not ingesting the residue of the chemicals. But from a climate perspective, it's always best to try and buy organically if you can. We know obesity and cardiovascular and so many other issues are on the rise in our country, and it's linked to our diets and chemicals we're putting on our food. But the part I want to talk about is why, when we know that food is healthier, fresh food is healthier for us, but $1 at a grocery store cannot get you nearly what it can at a fast food restaurant. And that's actually the bigger health issue. Some of you may know there's a large lobbying arm in Congress from big agriculture. U.S. beef and dairy companies act collectively very similar to the way that the fossil fuel industry does, which was built on extensive climate change counter movements. Agriculture lobbying groups have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to block policies, and some individual companies actually spend a higher percentage than their oil counterparts. When they have influential policy, they can block climate progressive bills and continue the subsidies they receive from the government. Do you guys remember the headlines about all the milk that was being poured out when the pandemic hit? When everything shut down and no restaurants and schools were open, dairy milk was still got billions of dollars in bailouts despite continued lower demand. In fact, in 2018, 42% of revenue for US dairy producers came from government support, 42%. So when these large conglomerates of meat and dairy that are the suppliers of Tyson chicken nuggets and McDonald's hamburgers are subsidized, it's clear to see why a Big Mac is cheaper than an organic carrot at a farmer's market. There's an argument that eating healthy or plant-based is a privilege. And from this standpoint, it certainly can be. If you're having to feed your family for lunch and you can get a KFC bucket of chicken for $15 or one green smoothie, which one would you choose? You can certainly live a healthier lifestyle on a budget. Canned and frozen produce is just as nutritious as fresh because of the quick preservation of the nutrients. It's the convenience and the shift to processed foods that's contributing to the rising epidemic of obesity and other related issues. Okay, I'm conscious of time. A food desert is an urban area in which it is difficult to buy affordable goods and quality fresh food. I'm only going to talk about food insecurity as it relates to Dallas because my heart cannot handle the situations like Yemen and Kenya today. A food desert in Dallas, you might ask, but I can buy a pineapple in winter at my grocery store. So there can't be a food desert in this city. But we actually do. We have food deserts. They're typically low income areas where residents sometimes rely on public transport or the ability to walk to access services like a grocery store. South Dallas is a particular area of concern. The city paid millions of dollars to get an independently owned grocery store in the Highland Hills area where the residents didn't have a grocery store within 5 miles. Unfortunately, they had to shut their doors in January of 2021. So that means the residents are now back to shopping at convenience stores, fast foods, and gas stations. And obviously, none of them are supplying the food that a grocery store can. This was December 2020 when Dallas made international news about the thousands of cars lining up for food pantry services. We know there is no shortage of food. It's a lack of logistical transport and money. If we wanted to end world hunger, the day we decide to, there's no question we could. Adults living in food insecure households report poor physical health and are more vulnerable to a wide range of chronic conditions. The risk of experiencing depression, anxiety, mood disorder, or suicidal thoughts increase with the severity of food insecurity. So if you're looking to donate to a food pantry during these holiday season, maybe just think about what fresh food or a canned and vegetable, because they're just as nutritious. Nobody typically donates, carrots and potatoes. So maybe just a thought. Okay, rounding it out with our social environmental justice. And again, this is worthy of an entire presentation. You can go back to the feudal system and really see our class systems shaping up from the time of introduction of agriculture. When we were hunter-gatherer societies, there was little storage of food, and so therefore there was no power or control over people. When we introduced crops like grains, we began the taxation system, which paved the way for elite and working class. In the centuries that followed, we know about slavery and making foraging illegal and the culling of the wild bison. It's a whole topic to wrap your mind around, so I'll let you stew on that for after the presentation, but I want to jump to modern day issues. Because migrant field workers are a workers' rights issue. Even in times of extreme heat or wildfires, our demand for food doesn't decrease. As temperatures rise year after year, that is real people in the heat picking our food. 75% of agricultural workers in the US are foreign-born, 69% from Mexico. 1 in 3 agricultural families are below the poverty line. The next slide is from a slaughterhouse. It's just bones, but in case anybody is sensitive, I'll just say that. You can close your eyes, but it's not bad. Let's talk about a slaughterhouse, which is where every Office Pizza Party or Chick-fil-A or Walmart meat is sourced from. Can we all agree that no one, and I mean absolutely no one, grew up saying, when I grow up, I want to work, with formaldehyde and in this sort of setting? It's not a nice place to work. You're subject to disease, both zoonotic and respiratory, which we saw in COVID when so many meat factories had to be shut down because of the spread of COVID and the working conditions. Accidents are so common. There was a study done that showed that workers at slaughterhouses experienced higher prevalence of serious psychological distress compared to the US population, including trauma, PTSD, and anxiety. So, these people are underpaid. They're being paid about $23,000 a year. Of course, they have no benefits for our subsidized meat. I'll leave it at that. I've spared photos of slaughterhouse and the soundbite of a pig squealing, but very few of us could do this in real life. So, not to say that all the responsibility relies on anyone individually, but without individuals understanding the change that needs to happen, there will be no collective call to action and the policy change, which is the biggest piece in all of this. And this is where I try and make it circular. I created my own pyramid, but it's a pyramid of action. And here's just things that we can do individually, like act for policy and subsidy change. We can plant something. We can continue to educate ourselves. We can eat local and eat organic and eat regenerative and eat more plants. The foods we choose to eat in the coming years will have dramatic ramifications for the planet. A modern day diet that revolves around processed foods, meat and dairy will take a greater toll on the world's resources than one that revolves around a plant-based diet. We know climate change means drought, floods, heat, which affects growing crops and leads to more famine and a big change in seasonality. Farmers will have to change the way that they practice. Heavy use of such chemicals will also increase the pollution burden faced by downstream communities as flooding continues to increase. And then, of course, we have the people who are working in the extreme heat. But I have fireworks because my positivity, there are some really cool things that are going on. People are stepping up in this industry. There's a kelp farm article that Roger sent out. People are doing some really cool things with mushrooms. These guys are making leather with cactus. And COP26, so while they didn't talk about food and agriculture, they did say that they will talk about it in COP27. So, at least it's on the agenda for next year. So I have one homework piece for all of you. It's a mindfulness practice. Tonight, when you sit down for dinner, I'd like for you to just pause and look at every single item on your plate and think about where every single ingredient and spice and how it got here. Think about the seed it started from. Think about the person who planted it. Think about how it got watered. Think about the growing length, the seasonality, the region where it could have come from. Think about the transport and how it was packaged. And think about how many people have come into contact with all of it. If you enjoyed this practice, then may I ask that you extend it to the Thanksgiving table with your family. And if there is something in this presentation that interested you and you wish to explore further or take action in our local community, I would love to start our Plant People group in Discord as an action-oriented group, taking on maybe quarterly projects. So please get in touch with me via Discord or email or whatever. That is my time.
Great job, Rebecca. Very much appreciated. We're obviously running a little long today, but we do have a few minutes for questions. If you'll raise your hand on the screen, we can. Jan, I think you have a question.
I know the answer, mostly, but I was just wondering, seafood. I thought it was so much better that I would eat seafood versus meat, but is it very much better at all for the climate? Relatively speaking, I'm just curious.
Sure. And I am not the police on what people can eat. I just want to point out what the systems that are currently in place and how they can be improved. The lower the food chain that you eat, the better for the environment, right? So if you eat clams or mussels, it's better than if you're eating that farmed salmon. Again, a diet, it's so personal. And that's why it gets touchy. And I don't want to come in saying this is how people need to eat. But I think a very general blanket statement is the lower on the food chain you eat, the better it is for the environment.
I was really struck by how the huge disparity between mutton and beef versus chicken or other meat. So people who still want to be carnivores, at least, we can know what's the less destructive.
Yeah, exactly. I think the carnivore definition is actually that you only eat meat. Just while I was doing all that.
Oh, good to know.
Anyway, I think omnivore, includes both. But anyways, that's semantics. But yeah, even if you just reduce, just swap it out, will make a huge impact. And again, it's your personal carbon footprint impact, but it makes a difference.
I don't see any other hands raised, but perhaps, Rebecca, you would put your email in the chat. So if people have follow-up questions, there's a lot of praise for your very jam-packed and rich presentation, lots of information and lots of wonderful things for us to chew on, so to speak. So let's see, I don't see any other questions. So thank you so much, Rebecca. We really appreciate that wonderful presentation.
Sure thing.